It's this great legend that there are all these buildings that if you go into their basements, you see windows looking out into nothing, and you see all the great, architecture of a 19th century first floor that's down there.
A ruler takes the throne of a world built on the ruins of a fallen empire. Every newspaper and school book teaches only the new version of the past. However, the subjects still live in buried cities that hint at a much more advanced time.
What you're talking about is repurposing what's already there. The basement used to be first floor, so first floor is now the second floor, and the basement is what used to be the first floor.
The architecture reveals a level of skill that should not exist in the 19th century. It is not that simple, though. Historians claim workers in torn shirts mixed mortar with wooden tools to build these giants. But get this, the sheer volume of resources needed for just one building would have eaten an entire forest for breakfast. Truth beneath the floorboards. A deep look into the architecture of the 19th century reveals a reality that feels more like a movie set than a historical record. One sees massive brick buildings that seem to grow out of the ground with their lower windows half buried in the soil. The official explanation is that architects designed them this way for aesthetic reasons or to keep things cool. But here is the catch. Those windows have arched tops and beautiful decorative work that would be completely hidden from view if they were meant to be underground. It makes no sense to spend thousands of dollars on decorations that nobody can see. The truth is that these buildings were once much taller, and a massive wave of clay and earth covered the lower levels. One must wonder why the current world order wants everyone to believe these were just basements. The rulers of the past century had to create a version of history where they were the creators of greatness rather than the discoverers of it. If the common people understood that they were merely living in the ruins of a superior civilization, they would stop fearing the current laws. Every decorative bowl on a roof is a memorial to a disaster that was ordered to be forgotten. The logistics of delivering millions of tons of cargo to a buried city without railroads simply defies logic. It is much easier for a government to rewrite history than to explain the presence of industrial brick firing in a world of wooden shanties. The architecture stands as a silent witness to a time when people built to last, and the modern world is just a shadow of that power. The evidence is not just in the walls, but in the impossible numbers required to build them. When one looks at a specific building like the Imperial University in Tomsk, the numbers become overwhelming. To construct this single building, 3,500,000 bricks had to be fired in the year 1886. This figure sounds simple, until one calculates the fuel needed for such a massive task. The archival documents state that 1,150 fathoms of firewood were used. In terms that anyone can understand, that is 223 railway cars filled with dry pine. That is an entire forest literally burned to the ground for just one university. And get this, there were dozens of similar buildings being constructed at the exact same time in the same city. Where did they find all this wood when the roads were covered in a thick layer of clay? The quarries were buried under soil, and the logistics were in total ruins. Historians assure us that they managed, but the math says otherwise. Furthermore, the city supposedly had 37 brick factories operating at the start of the 20th century. Each factory required thousands of workers and hundreds of engineers to function. A brick factory is not just a small workshop where an old man makes pots by a fire. It is a complex industrial setup that needs precise coordination. First, one must extract the clay and sand from deep pits. In the 19th century, this was done with horse-drawn carts. One cart could carry about 660 to 880 pounds. This means millions of bricks would require thousands of trips over roads that turned into deep mud every time it rained. The processing part is even harder because the clay must be mixed with water in huge cast iron cylinders. These machines weighed hundreds of pounds and were powered by steam engines. If a single gear broke, the entire factory stopped and construction came to a standstill. The complexity of these factories suggests an industrial power that history has tried to hide. The industry that never was. The facades of these old European hotels and officer houses feature multi-level walls made of dozens of different types of bricks. Each element is unique with rounded corners or complex ornaments. Some buildings use 30 to 40 different profiles of bricks. Each type requires a separate metal mold that must be turned with perfect precision. If there is even a 1 millimeter error, the bricks will not fit together and the wall will fail. This is not a simple craft passed from father to son in a village. This is industrial production, with technical maps and quality control systems. One must ask where the specialists were trained to read these complex architectural drawings. There are no textbooks or schools for stonemasons in the archives that explain how to lay such complicated facades. Officially, we are told they did it all by intuition. But intuition does not help when you are trying to fit 40 types of bricks in a precise sequence on a 3-story building. The technology clearly existed, but then it suddenly disappeared from the record. In cities like Tomsk, one sees massive brick mansions from the late 1800s standing right next to primitive wooden cabins. Wood is much easier to process with just an axe, and a team of 4 men can build a cabin in a few days. It is cheap and accessible, but it does not last. So why did the city stop building with bricks and switch to a more primitive material? The official version says the poor people used wood while the rich used stone. But there are houses where the wooden part is an exact copy of the buried brick foundation underneath it. The windows of the wooden section are positioned directly above the bricked-up windows of the basement. This is not a coincidence. It shows that the wooden house was built on the ruins of a brick house that was already there. The foundations reveal a luxury and skill that the people who built the wooden parts did not possess. One researcher found a brick foundation beneath a simple wooden cabin that had a perfectly rounded corner. Setting a rounded corner is an incredibly difficult job for a mason, and it costs several times more than a straight corner. It is absurd to build such a luxurious base for a simple log cabin. The only logical explanation is that the foundation belonged to a complete brick house that was destroyed or buried. The survivors simply placed a wooden box on top of the ruins because they could no longer manufacture the bricks. The technology for brick production was lost after the disaster. The quarries were filled and the factories were destroyed. People turned to the forests because wood was all they had left. But they still remembered what happened, and they left signs in the architecture. On the roofs of the Bacteriological Institute and other old buildings there are strange stone pedestals. On top of these are stone bowls that look like inverted pots with an opening on top. Historians call them decorative vases, but they have functional shafts leading deep into the building. These shafts are lined with metal sheets to protect the masonry from heat. This is not for beauty. It is a system for a flame. These bowls were stylizations of the eternal flame meant to honor the people who died in the cataclysm. The fire would burn in the bowl and the chimney would provide a draft to keep it steady. Many people say this was just a fashion trend of the 19th century. Yeah, about that. Why would an architect spend a fortune creating a complex engineering system inside a decorative vase? A normal decoration is just cast in concrete and placed on a stand. These are functional memorials for a world that was buried under a layer of clay. The symbols of mourning are hidden in plain sight on the bridges and rooftops of the city. The hidden signs in the stone and sky. The old plans for the stone bridge are much more than just drawings. They are like a secret diary from a world that was very sad. These plans show that the bridge was built to be a monument to a giant tragedy. The drawings show many flower wreaths on the bridge's main legs. These were not just for decoration. In the old way of thinking, a wreath was a sign of a border between the living and the dead. Because these wreaths were put on a bridge, it suggests the bridge was meant to cross over a giant graveyard. Today, we call that graveyard a riverbed. If you look at the bridge now, those wreaths are gone. They were either chipped away or never built. This was done to hide the truth. If the wreaths were still there, people would ask what is buried under the bridge. They would realize the bridge wasn't built for business or travel. It was built to span the wreckage of a massive disaster that wiped out the people who lived there before us. We see this same pattern of hiding the truth in everyday things, like the strange window covers in the city of Tomsk. Historians say these wooden covers were used to keep out thieves. But even a small child could open the locks from the street. Their real job was much scarier. They were not made to keep out people. They were made to keep out the black breath. When the world went through a great reset long ago, the air became full of a very dangerous dust. This dust was made of ground-up stones from destroyed buildings. For many years, the wind was like a weapon. It carried layers of dry dirt that could hurt your lungs. These window covers worked like seals on a ship. They turned every home into a safe box that the dust could not enter. This was a way to survive a global breathing crisis. History books try to hide this by saying the covers were just for the cold Siberian winters. If you look closely at the old wood, you can see tiny holes. These were made by dust hitting the wood at very high speeds. No normal storm could do that. The ghost cities and the rising mud. When we look at the very first photos from the 1800s, the mystery gets even stranger. These photos show big cities like Paris, London, and Moscow, but the streets are completely empty. Skeptics say the streets look empty because the cameras were slow. They claim people were moving too fast to be seen. But this logic does not work. In these photos, the horses are gone, the carts are gone, and even the tiny bits of dust in the air are frozen in place. Yet, there is not a single blurry shape of a human being. These cities were not busy places. They were empty sites where the new leaders were counting the items left behind by the old world. The streetlights were already working, using a type of electricity from the air that we no longer understand. The few men we do see in these photos look like inspectors. They are wearing tall hats and standing in the middle of messy roads. They were not residents. They were sent there to see which buildings could still be used. This leads to the lies about how these buildings were made. We are shown photos of men in fancy suits standing on weak wooden frames. They claim they are building giant stone structures that weigh many tons. However, the photos do not show the big machines needed to move such heavy rocks. There are no deep holes in the ground for the foundations. There are no muddy tracks from the thousands of horses that would be needed. These photos were staged to make us think the new leaders built these cities. In reality, they just found the buildings and cleaned them up. The true builders who knew how to use sound and special stone had been erased from history. The strongest proof is found in the sunken houses. In many old cities, the main windows are half buried in the mud. Architecture rules say you never put windows at the level of the dirt or water. Experts say the houses just settled into the ground over time, but that is impossible. A heavy stone house cannot sink 6 feet into solid dirt without cracking and falling apart. These houses were built on high, dry ground. They were covered by a mud flood, This happened when the earth shook so much that the ground turned into a liquid sea of mud. It rose up and then turned hard like concrete in just a few hours. This mud buried the old technology and the history of the past. We are now living in the top floors of a giant civilization, walking on the ceilings of history and calling it the ground floor. Why are we being told a version of the past that does not match the evidence in the stone? One must wonder if a similar disaster could happen again tomorrow while we are busy looking at our screens. The stones of Tomsk tell a story of a great empire and a silent cover-up. It is time to wake up and see the world for what it really is. If the truth makes one uncomfortable, that is because it is working. Make sure to like this investigation and subscribe to stay tuned for more mysteries that the textbooks refuse to mention.